Good evening and welcome to Shute Festival. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Sam Knights. I'm one of the founders of this festival, normally set in the rolling hills of East Devon. I'm delighted to have Luke Harding, Guardian foreign correspondent, with us this evening. The sort of in-depth, long-lead investigative journalism that Luke does could not be more important in this age of instant headlines, fake news and worse. Luke, as well as being an award-winning journalist, has written many books, including Mafia, A Very Expensive Poison, and Collusion, all on the theme of Russia, where he was the Guardian's Moscow bureau chief until his expulsion in 2011. We're here this evening to talk about his new book, Shadow State, in which Luke gives a deeply disturbing account of how the Kremlin has triumphed in the Cold War era, infiltrated high-level politics, and the establishment in numerous countries and in the US and in the UK in particular. If you haven't yet got a copy, it does read like the pages of a spy novel, but unfortunately it's not fiction. We're going to be sure to leave time at the end for questions to Luke from you all, and we have a number of questions already put into the question box at the bottom, so please do put your questions in there, and you can vote for other people's questions and any comments down the side too. So, Luke, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I wanted to start off really by asking you about how you came to write this book, why you particularly wanted to focus on this subject and what you're up to at the moment.
Yeah, well, Sam, hello, and very good to speak to everybody. It's actually, there's a rather weird echo on my line here, so just bear with me. I can hear myself sort of repeating in my head, which is slightly strange. But I'm a sort of career foreign correspondent of The Guardian. Actually, you know what, Sam? I'm going to have to do something about this. Hang on. Am I still there?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay, that's fine. I'm sorry. I was an idiotic middle-aged man, technical malfunction. I had two windows open, so it was myself talking at myself. Anyway, let's try again. Anyway, hello, Shute Festival. Hello, everyone who's watching. Thank you very much. Just to say, by way of kind of preliminary, I actually grew up not too far from Shute. I was, as a kid in the late 70s and early 80s, I lived in Exeter, and my father's family are from Devon. I kind of love Devon. I sort of hope that in some post-virus fantasy future, I should actually come and we can sort of start doing literary events in the real world. Anyway, that's something to hold on to in our dark times. But just to sort of go back to your question, how did I write this book? Well, so I've been a foreign correspondent on The Guardian for about 20 years or so. I started my career in Delhi, and then I moved to Berlin. I covered George Bush's disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. For quite a while, I was The Guardian's war and death guy, specializing in sort of frontline reporting. And then in the summer of 2006, my then boss flew to Berlin. We had a very civilized dinner. The World Cup was taking place, and she said to me rather kind of Delphically, "I think you need a bigger canvas." And what that meant was, I suspect that no one had applied to be a Russia correspondent, and I was being kind of propelled out there. And so I went with my wife Phoebe and our two quite small children in early 2007. This was literally a few weeks after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London with a radioactive cup of tea. Really one of the kind of most shocking crimes of the 21st century. I mean, we've had others since, but it was an appalling thing which cast a shadow over relations between London and Moscow, and really also impacted on our lives as a family, my professional life as a Guardian reporter, but also our kind of personal lives. And you know, very, very quickly, having arrived in Moscow, I sort of found myself flung into what you might describe as a rather badly written sub-John le Carré spy thriller, in which unpromising young men in black leather jackets would follow me around the icy streets of Moscow. It was made pretty obvious that someone was listening to my phone calls because, you know, for example, whenever I made a joke about Vladimir Putin, the line would be cut, and I would just get like in the movies. And then, of course, you make another joke about Vladimir Putin and the line is recut. So there was that kind of petty harassment, and also a sort of series of break-ins at our family apartment, which the British Embassy in Moscow advised us were being done by the FSB, Putin's old service, which he headed before he became prime minister and president, and that this was Moscow's worst kept diplomatic secret, and that the Russian secret police were also hounding, flat breaking American diplomats, British diplomats, Russian opposition figures, and so on. And that we were also, I was told, not only bug, but also video. There was sort of surveillance in our bedroom, which may be important when we go on to speak about Donald Trump. So we in short, we had a pretty kind of dark time in Russia. I tried to get to the bottom of the Litvinenko story, to tease out the Russian state role and the FSB. I looked at top level Kremlin corruption and tried to answer the question how much Putin might have in his bank account. Answer, he's the richest guy in the world, but formally it's not his, or it's sort of held through proxies. And I also traveled to the North Caucasus and detailed what's really a kind of underreported conflict there between radical Islamists, terrorists, you might say, and federal and local security forces with acts of brutality on both sides. So, and this culminated in my being kicked out of Russia in 2011, expelled, basically flipped back at the airport with my visa annulled and deported. And really ever since I've been back in the UK, I've been chronicling Russia's misadventures internationally. So I'm not reporting so much on what's happening inside Russia, but I'm doing the road show, you might call it. And in a way, my experiences in Moscow have helped shape my writing, interpret what's going on. And it's been one fell deed after another. I mean, it started when I was in Moscow with the war in Georgia, and then moved on to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the war in eastern Ukraine, and these sort of spectacular Soviet-style assassinations. Litvinenko we've talked about, but also Sergei Skripal, who's the opening of my new book, Shadow State. And then, of course, 2016 and the election of Donald Trump, which, was a huge thing. And the Russians helped. Whether you love Trump or hate Trump, they helped Trump. Sorry, that was too long an answer. But anyway, go ahead.
A great beginning. And I want to just go back, if we can, to that period when you were, first in Moscow, because as you said, there were kind of, groundbreaking events taking place. It was the aftermath of Litvinenko, but it was also the period where we see this great ascendancy of Putin and this consolidation of power. He's won this landslide second term as president in 2004. He comes back in 2008 as prime minister to Medvedev. But it looks as if at this time that the West is seeing him as somebody who is concerned about internal dissent. He's trying to rein in the oligarchs and reassign assets. But he's not necessarily being seen at this time as somebody who's got wider foreign policy ambitions. Is that right? I mean, how did you see it on the ground?
I mean, Sam, that's sort of interesting. Essentially, what he was doing, his sort of primary focus for his first two presidential terms was to squash opposition. And when I was there, the Russian opposition were basically kicked off state TV. Russian TV channels owned by oligarchs like Guzinsky and Berezovsky was seized, and it was a sort of squeezing out of dissenting forces from Russian public space. And that project was kind of more or less complete by the time I arrived, and plus the jailing of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Russia's richest man, who was unwise enough to kind of fund anti-Putin sort of parliamentary groups and had ambitions of his own. So it was primarily domestic. I mean, the thing is, when I arrived, I thought rather naively that Russia was a semi-democracy. Okay, not a full democracy, but sort of heading down that kind of late 20th century line, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, towards liberalism and so on. And in fact, what Putin and his KGB friends did was to come back after the reverses of the early 90s and stage a counter-revolution. And his vision of Russia was a far darker and more authoritarian vision of Russia. And so when I was there, yeah, it was mostly about. Also, he didn't really take on the oligarchs. What he did was he took on some of the oligarchs, but he and his friends became themselves oligarchs. So it was essentially, it was more about taking resources from one group and reassigning, bringing it within the state and the security structures and the bureaucracy. And Putin and his friends became very rich. I mean, they're now the richest people on the planet. They're collectively worth, I don't know, 400, 500, 600, 700 billion dollars. I mean, huge sums of money.
Right.
So that was his project, but there were sort of trends, there were clues if you were to look about what he planned to do next.
Right. Can I just ask you about this sort of inner circle? Because you can see this sort of, amassing of people who are going to be loyal to him, and these former KGB men who he seemed to, surround himself with, who he really trusted. I mean, one of the themes in your book is about the military intelligence units and the very key role that played, the GRU. So were you aware of them at the time, or was that something which we in the West sort of missed a bit at the time?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the GRU sort of rose. I mean, now they've become quite notorious. But one of the people I quote in my book is Viktor Suvorov, who's a former GRU intelligence officer. I mean, he is, so far as we know, I mean, other than Skripal, who's in hiding and won't ever talk, he's the only GRU person to speak publicly about his organization. And I got to know him after the Litvinenko poisoning, and he was friends with Litvinenko. And he said to me that the KGB, which squashed domestic dissent and which became the FSB, it had this huge physical building, the Lubyanka, in the center of Moscow, with a statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of Lenin's secret police, in the middle. It was very high profile. Everybody knew what it was, and its function was to protect the state and to wipe out subversion. The GRU, Suvorov said, by contrast, it was always in the dark. It was Russian military intelligence. It was a bitter rival with the KGB, and its mandate was global. It was everywhere. It was and super secret. And certainly when I was in Moscow up until 2011, the GRU was not as high profile. The emphasis was on the FSB. We'd had the Litvinenko murder. Putin had headed it, and it was the rise of what Patrushev, a close ally of Putin, the head of the FSB at the time, called Russia's new nobility. Mm-hmm. This was a sort of shadow government, almost a super secret organization, which became really Russia's preeminent institution. And it's only in the last few years with Skripal and a few other operations that the GRU has come to the fore.
Yes, and I mean it's really clear when you read this book, the high level of source material you've got, and this sort of ability to talk to people like Suvorov. But I mean, how do people like that remain safe? Because he's obviously in a position of knowing enormous amounts, but yet has been prepared to talk to you and to others, and he's not the only one. I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a small group of defectors in both in the UK and US from that period. And one of the questions I try and examine is why they went after Sergei Skripal, because really, pre-spring 2018, when he was whacked by these two Russian assassins, Petrov and Bashirov, actually called Chupiga and Mishkin, no one had really knew who Skripal was. The most famous Soviet defector in the UK is Oleg Gordievsky, who was shipping secrets to MI6 for 11 years. And not only that, was kind of dramatically exfiltrated in the mid-1980s by British intelligence from Russia after he got busted. And that, by the way, is the story in an excellent book by Ben McIntyre, The Spy and the Traitor. It's a great book. So Gordievsky is number one. Suvorov was probably number two. And he defected in 1978 and wrote a thrilling novel about his experiences in the GRU called Aquarium, which begins in the most gruesome fashion with someone from the GRU who spilt secrets being strapped to a conveyor belt, arms and legs tied down, and fed into the GRU's crematorium while still alive. Showing how the GRU regards traitors. So, you know, Gordievsky 1, Suvorov 2, Skripal, you know, number 9 or 10. And I think, I think he was, we can discuss this. I think he was targeted for various reasons, but one of them was he was probably the most unprotected of the defectors, living quietly and pretty publicly in Salisbury, and relatively easy to track down.
Right. So, Salisbury is obviously in our very near abroad here. It's only about an hour up the track from where we are in Shute. And of course, it absolutely, you know, ricocheted through British society, not least because it led to the death of a completely innocent British citizen. But it is interesting why Skripal and why in 2018. I mean, he obviously was a double agent. He was caught in 2004, and then there was this spy swap, I think, with Anna Chapman.
That's right.
In 2010. So there he'd been sitting quietly. In your book, you talk about, I think, Mark Urban, BBC journalist who goes to see him, and he seems very loyal to the Russian state. He's totally different to Litvinenko. Litvinenko was speaking out. Politkovskaya, obviously, you know, active in Chechnya. These are people who were very, very hostile to the Russian state and to Putin, but Skripal wasn't. So what was going on? Do you think it was more about sending a message to the West than, or was that a factor too?
Yeah. The difference between Skripal and Suvorov and Gordievsky is Suvorov and Gordievsky did it for ideological reasons, and Skripal did it. He got recruited by MI6 in the 90s after the Soviet Union had collapsed, and he basically did it for the cash. We think it was a tough time where people were living on their wits, and he got approached by a plausible businessman who brought gifts for his wife and turned out to be an MI6 officer. And then he was supplying kind of medium grade secrets about GRU personalities, their command structure, and so on. And he got caught. And I think he'd forgotten. I kind of explore this, but he's sort of forgotten. These ghosts for him had disappeared, but actually the GRU hadn't forgotten him. And I think they hit him then for two reasons. One was there was a sort of presidential election coming up. It was 2 weeks before the presidential election, which Putin, of course, was going to win, because all elections in Russia are elections. They're not genuinely competitive exercises. In a way, this was a sort of artificial confrontation with the West, with London, but also kind of the US as the great enemy once more. And obviously that helps to galvanize conservative voters in Russia. But ultimately, I think it was a message, a sort of twofold message. The message, in large part, was to the UK, to the faltering then government of Theresa May, and in particular to MI6, an organization that Putin loathes. And that message was, we will deal with our traitors, whenever we want, however we want. And you are weak, especially after Brexit, and there's nothing you can do about it. So it was a kind of V sign to the UK and its establishment. But I think ultimately the message of Skripal was directed back towards Russia, to people within the GRU or the FSB or the SVR, which is Russian Foreign Intelligence. And you have to understand the context, which is that Robert Mueller was busy investigating collusion, the Russian role in the 26 US election. And there'd already been one kind of defector whom I write about in the book, who'd been smuggled out of via the Adriatic to America. And essentially it was a message to other people within the Russian elite who were thinking of defecting and telling the Americans what they knew, or the Brits. And the message was very intelligible to all. It's that you may get a new life from Florida or Wiltshire or Shute or wherever. You may think you're safe, but we will come and find you. And when you are looking, in the far distance, we will smash you from behind. And those kind of poison things, Putin seems to, this sounds a bit frivolous, but he seems to get off on them. Litvinenko, Skripal, and most recently Alexei Navalny, poisoned in Siberia, who we can talk about him separately if you like, but it's clear that these murder operations are authorized by the very top of the state, and this is Putin. This is Putin giving orders, and no man, no problem, just like in Stalin times.
Yes. Well, before we leave the Skripals, the other thing which I think is so fascinating in your book is this role of actually working out who the killers were. And it wasn't the British intelligence services which got to the two individuals first. Once their photographs had been put out, it was a young guy with a computer and a website called Bellingcat. That's extraordinary. I mean, that's a game changer, isn't it, in terms of the way that intelligence works, in terms of the way you piece together what happens in the fog of murder or war or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, of all the I love writing books. I love writing this book, but the chapter I think I most enjoyed writing is called "Everything Is Open," and it's about the rise of Bellingcat. And for the older audience, when I'm not being in any way ageist, but some of you will remember All the President's Men, the wonderful film about Watergate. From the 1970s, the whole Watergate scandal with Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford, and the image we have in our heads for an investigative journalist is it's a bloke. It's always a bloke with sideburns, banging on doors, burning shoe leather, this kind of thing. And actually, we need to chuck that in the bin, because these days the best investigative journalists are kids of either gender. I mean, mostly they're guys, but not always guys, sitting in front of a MacBook Air with a skinny latte, delving into open source data. That's what's going on. That's what Bellingcat did. I mean, they really out MI6. They used the explosion in digital technology, YouTube videos, open source information, Facebook, Twitter, geolocation devices, Instagram, to plus leaks. They exploited the fact that Russia is a very corrupt society, and you can buy databases of people's home addresses, even of their passport details. They put all this together and managed to de-anonymize the two Skripal killers, or almost killers, Petrov and Bashirov, like I said, and found out that one of them was a doctor and one of them was a sort of professional assassin, and traced their life stories and so on, and did it with a bit of a swagger and dramatic flourish. And I think that's one of the really interesting themes of the 21st century, the rise of non-state spying. It used to be the CIA, it used to be MI6, it used to be, guys in huge secret doing this in huge secrecy. And now actually anybody can do it. You just need a bit of ingenuity, an understanding of how the open source world works. Preferably you need to be under 30. And you can break dazzling stories as good as anything The Guardian does or the New York Times.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, this is a great point, actually, to kind of jump back a bit and talk about the Russian interference in the US elections, which is one of the central themes in your book. So you interviewed Christopher Steele, the former MI6 officer, the author of the Trump dossier. We've obviously now got the 450-page Mueller report, if anybody has the time to wade through it. Which
I actually have it just to show you. There it is.
The Russian government interfered in sweeping and systemic fashion. So who was driving this interference? When did it begin? And what was the purpose of it?
Yeah, well, I mean, driving it is easy peasy. I mean, that was Putin. It's a triangle, and all major decisions, especially if they have international geopolitical consequences, have to be made by him. So not only does he determine life and death for traitors, he would also sign off on a huge operation, which is what it was, to try and upend and sabotage American politics and democracy. So, I mean, when did it start? I mean, in a way, actually, with Donald Trump, you can go back to the 1970s. I mean, I had pre-virus, I went to Prague and was rooting through the archives with a Czech colleague, and found some of the reports by the Czechoslovak secret police into Donald Trump, whose first marriage was to Ivana, a woman from beyond the Iron Curtain, all about what they were doing and so on. Now, this product would have been sent to Moscow. Then we have a very weird interlude, which I write about in, sorry, this is becoming show and tell, but Collusion, my pre-Shadow State book, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller, exploring collusion about Trump's visit to Moscow in the mid-1980s, where he was basically invited over by the Soviet ambassador in the KGB to talk about a hotel deal. This is in the 80s. And the point is that Trump, I'm not suggesting he was formally recruited by the KGB in the late Cold War, but what he did do, and we know this from documents that Gordievsky leaked, is that he ticked all of the boxes for what a potential Western asset would look like to the KGB. That they had a personality questionnaire, and the kind of people they were looking to influence or to get alongside were vain, narcissistic, greedy, prone to adultery and affairs, motivated only by money, and with little capacity for analysis or self-reflection. And you look at Trump, and he's off the scale on the kind of KGB, asset evaluation test. He's just gold. And so, I think basically Trump was on the radar for Soviet and Russian intelligence for a long time. And I think that they got reinterested in him around 2011, 2012, when Obama was in the White House. Trump was a mega star, mega reality TV star. And he started being, America's foremost exponent of birtherism, this fake creed that Obama is a Muslim born in Kenya. And it was actually quite effective. Many Republicans still believe it. Trump talked about it endlessly. And then, of course, he comes over to Moscow in 2013 for the Miss Universe beauty pageant, and so on. And so I think when Trump announced his kind of long shot campaign for the presidency in 2015, the Russians kind of alighted on that. And not because they thought he was going to win. I don't think they thought he was going to win. But they saw him as the perfect vehicle for discrediting the American democratic process. And inflaming existing kind of political, cultural tensions in America. And my God, did they back the right guy? I mean, 4 years on, we've all aged by 40 years. And what's interesting, and I was just writing about this today for The Guardian, is I don't think the Russians are doing very much this election campaign. They don't need to. They've already won. They see the election of Donald Trump in 2016, to which they kind of co-contributed, as the greatest espionage operation in Soviet and Russian history. Trump has advanced KGB goals in a way the KGB never could. And even if he goes down in flames in November, this is a glorious episode, up there with the Cambridge Five, with the murder of Trotsky. It's going to be emblazoned in gold for all time.
Yes, I mean, you talk in the book about the methods that we use, and obviously hindsight is a great thing. But when you look at this sort of spear phishing, and you look at these websites that were set up, I mean, they seem actually pretty simple in some ways, and yet numerous members of the Democratic Party fell for them. I mean, it caused absolute chaos. But as you say, is it going to happen again in the same way?
Well, I mean, just on that, I mean, one of the things I try and explore, is to go sort of beyond Mueller. And Mueller just gives you the facts, but he never really gives you the narrative. And his prose style is ploddingly dull. I mean, I defy anyone to read all 450 pages without keeling over. But one of the points I try and make is that, in 2016, and also, I mean, we'll come on to Russia and Brexit, but America was basically brought down by a bunch of foreigners they didn't understand. And there's a kind of cultural imbalance. I mean, Russian spies these days are not Brezhnev-style generals creaking around in olive uniforms with jangling medals and epaulets. They are charming. They are bookish. They are oligarchs. They are students. They are businessmen. They all speak impeccable English. Sometimes learnt in spy schools, sometimes learnt at very good British or American universities. They love their kids, and they very often have their own commercial projects, but ultimately they are advancing malign Kremlin interests for whatever reason. And conversely, we still don't know much about Russia, actually. Very few people speak Russian. A lot of the sort of Cold War, diplomatic knowledge, linguistic knowledge is gone. And I think it's a problem. And one of the reasons I keep writing these books, Shadow State, Collusion, and so on, is as a kind of wake-up call to the British and American political elite, who still, despite everything, don't take this problem seriously enough. And just lastly on this, it's not to say that Putin is all-powerful, some evil genius sitting in a cave, pressing buttons, red consoles, making stuff happen in London or Washington or Kiev or Paris or Shute or wherever. He's not. He's just an opportunist He's a classic KGB opportunist who doesn't create the problems that are out there, but seeks to exploit and instrumentalize them. And that makes him a very dangerous foe, because his great talent is spotting our weaknesses. And at the moment, in 2020, they are many.
Yeah, I mean, the Russia reports also highlighted this, the weakness in the intelligence services, the lack of Russian expertise, and of course, you know, the number of places you can learn Russian, the number of schools you can learn Russian in the UK, you know, very, very few and far between. But let's talk about Brexit before we open up to questions, because and bring it, you know, a little closer to home. So, did the Kremlin interfere in Brexit? The Russia reports silent on this, and you know, and what about the Air Banks and the Russian gold fiasco?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that they did, and I just sort of preface everything I say on this by, you know, wherever you stand on Brexit, whether you love it and think it's a great idea, or whether, like me, actually you don't much like it and think it's a bit of a rolling disaster, it doesn't matter. I mean, what's key is that it's wrong that any election, whether it's, you know, the EU referendum vote in 2016 or the American election, or indeed a future Scottish Indy Ref 2, which, you know, by the way, I think is coming pretty quickly, that foreign powers should interfere in that. And what happened in 2016 is there was a parallel operation, you know, one to push Donald Trump, and two to push Brexit, quite often involving the same people. This is something I explore in the book. I mean, certainly the same trolls who were posting sort of anti-Clinton messages from St. Petersburg were also posting pro-Brexit and you know lurid immigration scare stories in UK informational space. And in addition, there was a kind of what you might call a kind of trad espionage operation featuring someone called Udod, Alexander Udod, which I explore in Shadow State, who in the autumn of 2015 got alongside Arab Banks, the key Leave EU people, invited Banks to meet the Russian ambassador in London. There was a secret lunch. There were other meetings. Banks was offered a gold deal in Siberia, a diamond deal involving a Russian state diamond firm, another gold deal. Now, he says he didn't take any of these deals. But the point is that the Kremlin had a spy at the heart of the Brexit campaign. He had drinks with Banks a week before the vote. He was even at the UKIP victory party. And we don't know. I mean, basically, Putin's technique with any kind of narrow vote is to push the side he wants. We don't know if Russian help pushed Brexit over the line or not. But what's clear is that any British government would want to ask that question and find out what happened. But what the Russia report tells us is that neither Theresa May nor the government of Boris Johnson wanted to ask that question. And to my mind, that's extremely short-sighted. And what the Russia report says is that London has become Londongrad. It's awash with Russian money. That not all Russian actors in London are bad ones, but many of them are doing Kremlin, a link to the Kremlin, are doing kind of Kremlin influence projects.
Right. I mean,
yeah.
The report actually says there are a lot of Russians with very close links to Putin who are well integrated into the UK business and social scene and accepted because of their wealth. And I think what's extraordinary about the report, because it is quite muted on a lot of things, but it's not muted on the influence, a soft influence, if you like, or less soft influence of Russian money in London, and oligarch money. But the report comes out on the 21st of July of this year. And 10 days later, Boris Johnson gives peerage to Yevgeny Lebedev, who has apparently courted Johnson as a friend, whose father's a billionaire, and a former KGB spy. I mean, is this a wise appointment in the light of everything that we know and the Russia report?
I at the risk of sounding vainglorious, I sort of feel that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings gave Yevgeny Lebedev a peerage just to annoy me and The Guardian. I think it was personal. It was basically, how do we stick it to the hated liberal Remainers? I know, let's make the son of a KGB spy appear. I mean, you know, for those who haven't been paying close attention, I mean, so Alexander Lebedev was one of my best contacts in Moscow. He was a KGB officer at the Soviet embassy in London in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He subsequently went into banking and the media. And then in 2009, he bought The Standard and The Independent a year later, installing Yevgeny, his kind of dilettantish oligarch's son as sort of gentleman proprietor. And I've spent a lot of this year actually looking at the Boris Yevgeny friendship. It's still something of a mystery as to why Yevgeny got this peerage. But just, you know, when they make the film version of Shadow State, which I think may happen at some point. I mean, one scene I hope they include is just 2 years ago, Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson dumped his Met security detail, flew to the Lebedev's palazzo in Umbria in Italy. This is 3 weeks after Skripal had been poisoned. So he goes without his bodyguards, spends the weekend there. Lebedev is known for throwing these extremely decadent, hedonistic parties. Let's put it like that. Sam, you're a lawyer, aren't you? So you know there are constraints to what one can say in public. And he's spotted the next day, deeply hungover, shirt crumpled, holding a book, scarcely able to stand up, going back again. What did the Lebedevs discuss with Boris Johnson? We don't know. Was it appropriate for him to go at a time of Moscow, London crisis, when Russian hitmen had been roaming around not far from Shute, trying to kill someone, creating an unprecedented public health emergency? No, it wasn't. It was terrible judgment. Is Lebedev's peerage going to end well? I suspect it isn't. And I mean, Johnson may want, you know, help from the Standard and help from the Independent, and help from Lebedev, in the way that Trump was willing to, you know, take help from the Russians in 2016, because he's an immoralist and he kind of doesn't care as long as it benefits him. I mean, it could be for narcissistic reasons, but whatever, it's a bit of a counterintelligence horror show, and I'm kind of amazed that this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's also you know, weirdly similar to Trump in July of 2018 ditching his advisor Fiona Hill and his interpreter and going off for a 2-hour meeting with Putin by himself. What did they talk about? I mean, you talk about this in your book. I mean, it's
I know I'm speaking too long. I'll just be very quick on this. So I have a chapter called "You and I," which is a quote from Suvorov from the Jungle book. It's what you say to someone you really like. You say, "You and I are blood brothers." And I think when you look at Trump's weirdo behavior with Putin, and this is the one consistent theme in his doomed, misbegotten presidency, is his fealty, his flashing behavior towards Putin. And I have a whole chapter on their bilateral summit in Helsinki. But just to say, I don't think Putin says to Donald Trump, you know, do what I say, Donald, or I release the tape of you in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in 2013 with 2 prostitutes. I think what Putin does, in the manner of a classic KGB asset handler, is to say to Donald Trump, I am your friend. I get you. I understand you. You can rely on me. I will be your rock in good times and bad. And I'll never betray you. And by the way, you're completely right about the deep state, about American intelligence, about liberals plotting against you. In other words, he whispers in his ear like worm tongue. And some of Trump's bizarre pronouncements on geopolitics. I mean, at one time, he slagged off Montenegro. I'm sure he doesn't know where Montenegro is on the map. I'm certain have come from Putin whispering ideas in his head, which then Trump repeats, and they then enter the kind of Fox News, you know, eco-information system, and they become alternative fact. It's very dangerous. We've seen nothing like this before. And the only reason I keep writing my books is because this kind of weird, surreal juggernaut keeps rolling forward in a truly alarming way.
Yeah, well, that's a great moment to ask you. I mean, in the light of the Navalny poisoning, it doesn't look like Russia's going to change anytime soon. So what should the UK, at least, what should the UK response be? You know, should we use sanctions? Should we use smart sanctions, Magnitsky Act, diplomacy? What's the way forward?
Well, I mean, first of all, just to say, and I haven't said this yet, so I need to say it. You know, Russia is not Putin and his kind of KGB clique. Actually, Russia is a great country. It's a marvelous place. I love my time there. Of theater, of friendship, of vodka, of course, of music, of wonderful literature, great architecture, and so on. So we mustn't confuse the two. So anything we do must not affect the kind of, you know, good, decent Russia, which is still there. It just has to target the people at the top. Maybe 4,000 people, I would say. it's a sort of neo-feudal structure run by people who've stolen huge amounts of money from Russians primarily. They're the victims in this grisly saga, and so we need smart sanctions. We need to, because despite all its sort of hyper-nationalism and kind of public bluster and Crimea is ours, what the Russian elite really care about is their money. And if they can't travel to the West, if they can't go to London, if they can't send their kids to top British universities or private schools, if they can't access their wine collection in Switzerland or their yacht moored off Sardinia, this is deeply irritating to them. And so it's asymmetric. It's not like sending tanks or fighting wars, but it's very powerful. And I think, you know, maybe a Joe Biden presidency, if we get it, and God knows what will happen in this country politically, but you know, more sanctions from the EU and from the UK actually, you know, is our best shot at having a deterrent effect on Russian rogue state behavior.
Interesting. So I want to turn actually now to ask or to allow the questions from our participants. We've got a very active set of people firing questions. But just before I do, on the subject of Russian culture, of course, we had a wonderful event a couple of weeks ago with Polina Shepherd, who I think is with us this evening on Russian folk singing. And I think,
hi Polina, yeah.
Luke, I think you and I actually met, first of all, in Moscow in about 2005 at some Russian cultural event with various wonderful Russian mutual friends. So, yeah, couldn't agree more on that front. Very interesting question from Meg Klein. Thank you, Meg. With the recent unrest, demonstrations, etc. in the region, Belarus, Karabakh, Kyrgyzstan, will there be any long-term implications in the balance of power for Russia? Or do you think Putin has enough shadow state clout to hold his center of power together?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. Meg always sends, you know, great questions. It's a pleasure to hear this one. I mean, I think what it will do is contribute to nervosity in the Kremlin. And how do we know that they're nervous? Well, I think the biggest piece of evidence is the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. I mean, for those who don't know Navalny, I met him actually when I was in Moscow for the first time. At that point, he was an anti-corruption blogger and activist, quite well known. But now he's the de facto leader of the Russian opposition, the real Russian opposition, with a huge following. And what he'd been doing against the backdrop of, as Meg says, unrest in Belarus, against a president who stayed in power, refused to move on, unrest in the Russian Far East, in Khabarovsk, where there have been weekly protests against the Kremlin, was to come up with a sort of what he calls smart voting. He was basically touring the provinces in Siberia, getting people to vote for any candidate other than the United Russia candidate, the ruling Putin party. And the thing was, it was working. It was actually working. And so the Kremlin were very nervous. I mean, he's been arrested on multiple occasions. He's had green paint thrown in his eye. And in August, they really tried to kill him. They put Novichok somewhere. Initially, we thought in his tea. Now we think possibly on a water bottle in his hotel bedroom. And he collapsed on a internal flight back to Moscow. And he was supposed to die, and he didn't, only because the pilot emergency landed the plane, and the doctors who stretchered him off gave him atropine very quickly, which was an antidote. And he was then, when it became an international embarrassment, able to go to Germany. And for those of you who speak Russian, who haven't seen it yet, Navalny gave an interview day before last to a celebrated Russian blogger called Yuri Dude. And it was one of the most incredible pieces of sort of, you know, political moment that I've seen. And he speaks for 2 hours, but just briefly, he talks about what Novichok does to you, and he likens it to being kissed by a dementor. He says he could feel himself dying. He could feel the life just being sucked out of him. And he spent 16 days in a coma, and he keeps going with the Harry Potter theme, and he talks about Putin's Nazguls. Actually, Nazgul is we're now Lord of the Rings. Actually, it's a different myth. But anyway, and that's what Putin does. He sends Nazguls to kill people, primarily Russians, but in this kind of lurid demonstrative way, formally denied, but everyone knows it's the Kremlin. So I think they're nervous. They're worried about popular insurrection. They're worried that a Belarus scenario could repeat in Russia. And the reason that ultimately they're worried is because actually they know in their heart of hearts they're not legitimate. They're not there for sound democratic reasons. They're there because they sit on power and money, and power is money in Putin's world. And I think it's going to be very hard to dislodge them.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, Navalny? Navalny said he's determined to go back to Russia to fight again. But I mean, whether that's feasible, whether he'll remain the course. But there is public opinion, isn't there, in Russia? Growing public opinion, I think, unease about Putin's power, his methods. I mean, he's just stifled dissent, he's stifled protests, he controls rule of law, but still there is still a powerful dissident voice.
I mean, it depends on whom you ask. I mean, would Putin win a free and fair election in Russia? Possibly. Will there ever be a free and fair election? Not while Putin's alive. Has Russia's opposition been systematically destroyed? Yes, it has. I mean, Navalny doesn't appear on state TV. He's followed, he's shadowed, he's hounded. So are all of his supporters. Fake criminal cases open up against them, and so on. So it's extremely hard to operate in that space. But you're right insofar as there is a dissenting group of people, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, especially people under 30. Not everyone under 30, but many people under 30 who want something different and have known nothing but Putin all of their adult lives. The problem is that it's a smart system. It's not Stalin. It's a 21st century tyranny where the borders are open. So if you're a 24-year-old with ambitions, you speak English, you can sort of leave and build a life somewhere else. And that's what's smart about it, is that many of the best, brightest Russians, many people in the Russian opposition think, do I sit and wait to be poisoned, or do I actually go to New York or London or Paris or wherever? Mm-hmm. But Navalny will go back. How long he'll be in play for, I don't know. But he and other Russian opposition people, including journalists, are the bravest individuals I know. And I write this book as a Western journalist, from some comfort. Okay, I've been hounded and kicked out, but the brave people are them, and I urge people watching this to support Russian journalism if you can, to read their stuff, and just to kind of send them karmic encouragement, because they really need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I wouldn't want to downplay your bravery at the same time. We've got a couple of questions relating to Christopher Steele and this tarnishing of him. One question from Mary. Last Wednesday, September 30th, James Comey testified before the Senate Judiciary concerning the FBI's handling of its investigation into Russian manipulation of the 2016 election. And Republicans inserted a new buzz phrase, Christopher Steele, Russian agent. So where does this concept come from?
Well, Sam, it comes from upside down land, which is that if you're a kind of Republican ally of Donald Trump, you turn everything on its head. So, for example, everyone's forgotten that actually Donald Trump was impeached earlier this year and surprise, surprise, acquitted by Republican-controlled Senate. But the kind of Trumpian Republican sort of disinformation narrative is that it wasn't Russia that interfered in 2016, it was Ukraine. And one of the ways that Ukraine allegedly interfered was that it fed, or Russian agents in Ukraine or whatever, fed a fake dossier to Christopher Steele. And I mean, basically, it's nonsense. I mean, the short answer is it's nonsense. It's not true. I mean, the Steele dossier, which I write about both in Collusion and Shadow State, is not immaculate. Steele would concede that it's a raw intelligence product put together in spring and summer of 2016. But what you have to credit Steele for is that he was more or less the first person to warn that the Russians had been cultivating Donald Trump for a long time and was supporting him, that there was an explicitly anti-Clinton operation to help install him in the White House, which succeeded. Now, he got that right. He got much else right as well, but there's been a long and perfidious campaign to undermine him, to out his sources, to try and sort of destroy his professional reputation. But actually, I've got a lot of time for Christopher Steele. I think he got the big things right. He didn't get everything right. And when we move on from this demented circus possibly soon, possibly not, I think there'll be a kind of rehabilitation of Steele, and he may feel that he can kind of tell his own story, give interviews, turn up at the next Shute festival, etc., on video. For the moment, I think he's so under sort of blunderbuss siege that he's keeping his head down.
Right. I mean, on the subject of Ukraine, we've got a question from Victoria, who is interested in your views on the future of the Minsk agreements on eastern Ukraine.
Well, I mean, I'm not, forgive me, I'm not wholly up to speed, although actually just before I came on, I was watching Andrei Yermak, who's the chief of staff of President Zelensky, who's in London at the moment. Zelensky has been in Downing Street, I think, today, seeing the Queen. Big kind of state visit, has signed a sort of post-Brexit trade deal. There's been some kind of agreement today. I mean, all I would say in brief is that I don't see any progress of any real prospect of success, not because the Ukrainians are not sincere, but because the Russian Federation does not want a settlement in Ukraine. It wants to make, I mean, Crimea regards as settled, but Donbass, the east of Ukraine, from where I reported in 2014 for The Guardian from the front line, it wants to keep it as a sort of frozen conflict where it can, like with other frozen conflicts, it can turn the dial up or down, hot or cold, depending on its strategic need and advantage. And wants to destabilize Ukraine and make it impossible for Ukraine to join NATO or the European Union and have a kind of Western choice, primarily because the Putin view of Ukraine is that it's sub-sovereign. He doesn't regard it as an independent territory. He regards it as a Russian province, a little brother, and more than that, he regards the whole, post-Soviet Russian near abroad as his, and indeed Eastern Europe, where he's kind of hugely active. And Ukraine is essential to the kind of make Russia great again project, which Putin sees as his historical destiny to fulfill and implement.
Yeah. Great. We've got a question from Lynette O'Halloran. Where does Mikhail Khodorkovsky fit into all of this? And obviously that's a whole fascinating period of history in recent Russian politics. While you're answering that, I'm going to go and turn the light on because I've been plunged into Shute.
Yeah, you do that. Well, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, I mean, he lives in London. I know him pretty well. He is a really interesting and engaging person. I mean, not least his personal story. I mean, he's much vilified by Kremlin state media, but to my mind, I mean, he was Russia's richest man. You can ask questions about how he became Russia's richest man, but he spent 10 years in jail in Siberia and elsewhere, and I think he's been on a kind of redemptive journey. These days, he tries to fund democracy in Russia, independent candidates, young aspiring people, and so on. Very, very hard to do in the current repressive environment. But I think he genuinely wants the best for Russia. And in a kind of alternative universe, he could be Russian president. Unfortunately, in this cosmos, I don't see that happening anytime soon, or indeed ever.
One last question. Again, I mean, drawing from the theme of the Russian report and the spread of Russian money and influence, a question again from Meg Klein. Chris Steele made some compelling points in his testimony to the Intelligence and Security Committee about things that the West and the UK in particular needs to urgently address in order to limit the spread of Russian money and influence. What do you think are the aspects currently being most neglected by Western leaders? Yeah,
another really great question from Meg. I mean, I think what is insufficiently understood, and again, why I wrote these books, is that when you kind of conceptualize, Russia and the world, it's not about bad guys about whom we know not so much, doing corrupt things in a faraway place, distant kleptocracies. Who cares about Azerbaijan or Russia or Putin, etc. It's actually ultimately, this story is the story about our corruption. It's about the corruption of our society and the fact that sure, there are, I think Trump is probably sui generis, but there is a whole group of Western enablers and accomplices who've grown rich from dirty Russian money. I'm talking about lawyers, Sam, not you, but others in your wonderful profession. Accountants who incorporate shady companies in the UK, in Scotland and elsewhere, in the British Virgin Islands, private school headmasters who keep turning up in these data leaks of dodgy offshore money that I get, Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, whose bursars don't inquire too deeply about where Sergei's bank transfer is coming on, and ultimately about politics. I mean, the whole Russia report was about the House of Lords. There are peers sitting in the House of Lords who have very lucrative directorships on Russian companies that can only exist because Putin allows them to. And also the Conservative Party. I mean, the Labour peers go to Yevgeny Levinov's parties as well, but Conservative Party in the UK has taken huge amounts of money. It's taken 1.7 million pounds from someone called Lyubov Chernukin, who keeps bidding to play tennis with Boris Johnson, and whose husband just happens to be Vladimir Putin's former deputy economics minister. They're British citizens. It's legal. I'm not making any allegations against Mrs. Chernukin, but it just doesn't look right. It doesn't feel right that people who are so close to the Kremlin are now able to influence British politics and outspend rival political parties. So we need to clean up our own act. We need to investigate, and by we I mean the whole Western world. France, Germany, the UK, US, wherever, Central Europe. Clean up our own act and do something about insidious shadow influence from Russia, and it's politics and it's corruption, and they go together. And ultimately, this story is about us as much as it's about them.
That's a great moment on which to end, because we've run out of time. But Luke, I want to say first of all a huge thank you for an extraordinary hour with you. If you haven't already bought the book, please do buy it. You really do need to read this if you care at all about the future of Western democracy and the Western politic. And do consider buying it from our wonderful local indie bookshop, Archway, and the link is at the top. They can deliver to you anywhere in the world: London, New York, Moscow. A huge thank you to you,
Sam. Can I just say one last closing thing? Is that all right? 30 seconds. I mean, just to say, to everybody who's watching, I really think this is like a kind of manifesto cry, really. I just think in dark times, when there's so much misinformation and anti-truth flying around, and politicians all over the place for whom lying has become second nature, that what we need truth, we need factuality, we need good books. I mean, not just mine, but other people's as well. We need evidence, we need to be empirical, and we need to be kind, and we need to be decent. And one way of doing that is by having these sorts of conversations with lovely festivals, with great questions, with great audience. So thank you. Let's do this. Let's try and have a kind of an enlightenment, a sort of neo-enlightenment would be great, to try and illuminate things where there's so much bleakness and darkness around in time of COVID. The more we can talk in a civilized and engaged way, the better it will be for all of us. And thank you, Sam, and thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you. And I mean, I just can't emphasize enough your courage in reporting, because I think a lot of people in your position would have sat in a much more comfortable way for 5 years in 4 or 5 years in Moscow, and wouldn't have written the stuff that you're writing, and they wouldn't be writing it now. It is courageous, and
they might still be there though, Sam. Unlike me, I'm barred.
And we will get you to Shute. I hope you will no doubt produce another blockbuster. So we will be able to invite you to Shute in person and host you in our usual way in lovely East Devon another year. So yeah, thank you all. Thank you to everybody too who's been making donations to Shute Festival. If there are any Russian oligarchs tuning in this evening, then clean money to support our festival. Absolutely, we would love it. But join us next week for something completely different, a panel event on the future of British farming. And in the meantime, thank you, Luke, and good evening to you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.